Welcome to the Marshall Pruett podcast presented by Cooper Tires. We are here with my friend, my NBCSN Indy Lights occasional co-pilot. He's full-time. I'm part-time there. Voice I think you've come to appreciate and trust as someone who's going to bring a lot of deep insights and quality analysis on the IndyCar Radio Network. Anders Krohn, how are you, buddy, here on a Tuesday morning?
Doing great, man. Yeah, no, it's kind of nice to be back in Indy, and obviously great to be on your podcast.
A little bit of house cleaning here to start off the episode, Anders, and it's not bad house cleaning. Had our first Marshall Pruett podcast live event last weekend, Saturday evening at Road America. The track asked me if I would help them to put on about a half-hour show, and I got to admit, I didn't know what to expect. I hope it was going to be an okay thing. It was phenomenal, just truly from a turnout standpoint, question standpoint. I had so much fun, Anders, and you're always nervous when you do something like that for the first time. We had Tony Kanaan, Indy 500 winner, series champion, Josef Newgarden, our reigning champion, who just set the pole about an hour earlier. I thanked him for that. So that was quite kind of you to do here for the first podcast live episode. Also had a surprise guest, Will Power, who turned up, our reigning Indy 500 winner, and also Mike Hull from Chip Ganassi Racing, who those of you who listen here probably know Mike well because he's on seemingly every week. And it was just a blast, Anders. Things got started about a half hour late. We were set to go at 5:35, and whether it was the World Challenge race starting late or ending late, I'm not sure what, but they had to put on their victory lane ceremonies, which is where we're hosting this. So honestly, man, we didn't get started basically until it was set to end. So I'm sitting there thinking, I think I'm about to put on a 5-minute podcast with 75 or 80 people who've hung around, and then I'm going to get lynched afterwards. And to everyone's credit, brother, they all hung out. They all spent well more than a half hour with us, and that was just a blast. So we're getting the video from that ready, and going to post that here soon. And right after it, they asked me to put on one for the upcoming IMSA race, so we'll be having another one at Road America. I had a manufacturer ask me to put on one at the IMSA season finale at Petit Le Mans, and I'm hoping to have a couple of others that we will put together at upcoming IndyCar races. So this whole little live podcast thing might be a thing, and if you're not careful, Anders, you might be on the panel at one of them.
Let's do it.
What else? And right after that, again, this is just one of those things where you go, this day is going to be the best ever. Road America asked me to head over to a dinner they were holding in Mario Andretti's honor, and I got to introduce the greatest of all time. And I mean, Mario and I are known each other for a while and are pretty friendly, but it's still just one of those things where you're thinking, when I was a kid, you never imagine you're going to do stuff like that. I mean, come on. And then sat down and had dinner with him and track president George Brugenthies, and so shared dinner, drank some of Mario's wine, and that was a delightful evening. One other little bit of newsy news to wrap up here. Just had the Marshall Pruett podcast added to Spotify, and while I'm working with Spotify to get the URL cleaned up a little bit, it is currently, whereas if you go to Podbean or a number of other places where the podcast is hosted, Anders, you can just type in either the Marshall Pruett podcast or use the URL with Marshall Pruett podcast. Right now on Spotify, the URL is 1JB3Q99Q5VDVMIYBHB8VWT. We're going to see if we can...
I think that has a great ring to it,
right?
Doesn't it?
Easy to remember. So we're going to see if we can upgrade that a little bit, something easier, but really, really happy to have the podcast on Spotify now. And we'll mention in a little bit when we get to questions that our dear friends at TorontoMotorsports.com actually have a cool little offer that for listeners here, going to have a little bit of clearing of merchandise for the Marshall Pruett podcast, because we're going to do a brand new Week in IndyCar t-shirt coming up here very shortly. All right, all that stuff out of the way. I thought we had the best overall event of the year last weekend in Elkhart Lake, best crowd, and I would say even topping the Indy 500 for this reason. Indy it's a bit of a built-in thing, I believe, Anders, right? It's what the state seemingly is built around. It's what the local cities are built around. It's a culture. You show up. It is part of the DNA. There's nothing really super close to Road America. And when you see the amount of people that drive from all over to come and partake, to fill the place, pack it with motorhomes, tents, just folks walking around, I struggle, Anders, to think of another track where we go and do road racing either with IndyCar or IMSA or World Challenge where more people drive a considerable distance, pack the place, and just show sheer love and warmth for what we do. What did you think about the weekend?
It blew me away. It really did, the amount of people that came out. And it's not just casual fans. These are fans that, to your point, it's not like there's 100,000 people living right next to Road America. So these are people that have sought out and gone out of their way to come to Road America. And as a result, almost every single fan that's there are knowledgeable and passionate about the sport. And I think that reflects in everything that we see. I mean, from the autograph session and sort of some of the questions, I actually did a Q&A down at the Firestone fan village with James Hinchcliffe, and just some of the questions that are being asked by the fans aren't casual, like how fast is your race car, but it was very intricate questions on kind of strategic questions. So it just, what I love about the fans there is they're so knowledgeable about the sport and they're so passionate about it, and so it makes it even better. And obviously it doesn't hurt the fact that every single driver loves the track, so then they promote it as much as they possibly can because everyone loves it. So it's got that feel-good place, and to be honest with you, there's only a few places that has that kind of soul, and one is obviously the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. When you go underneath the tunnel, you get the chills because it's got a soul. But Road America, I tell you what, it's got a very, very similar feel in that once you come to that place, you feel like it's got an identity, and it's kind of it's a whole different beast. So, and clearly the fans resonate with that as well. So no, it was a spectacular weekend. I think it was great to have the whole Mazda Road To Indy back as well, everyone together, and certainly Pirelli World Challenge as well.
Yeah, and I love the fact Robin Miller pointed out on Friday that, you know, I swear we had more people at Road America on a practice day than we do or will at a number of the events we've either had or that we will go to close out the rest of the year. So in one of the end-of-day videos we did, I asked, or threw the question out, do you think we could actually sustain 2 races here? Maybe one towards the end of the year, maybe the penultimate round, have it as the road course finale as well. Keep the June date, but also come back and have kind of a Road America gateway close to the season. And happened to run into Mark Miles on Sunday and floated the idea. And he said, A, he hadn't thought of it, and B, he wasn't sure because thinks we should be going to new markets. And I'm not one to tend to say the guy who is in charge of everything isn't seeing the greater opportunity here, but when you go to a place that has this much love, it seems to me that if there was a place to consider going back to, going to twice during the season, you'd probably want to consider the one that does have the biggest turnout from folks who just clearly, as you mentioned, give the place a kind of soul that we wish so many others had. Well, let's get into the race, Anders. What were some of your highlights and some of your lowlights as we saw Josef Newgarden put on a real clinic, man, leading 53 of 55 laps?
Yeah, and I think what stood out to me about Josef's performance was, yes, he dominated the weekend, but I don't think people realized how big of a struggle it was for him on the Firestone Blacks, and that he was able to hold off Ryan Hunter-Reay, who was substantially quicker than him on the Firestone Blacks. He withheld that pressure, and then obviously once he had those sticker reds for the final stint, it was pretty much a cruise for Josef Newgarden. But it would have been so easy for him to make a mistake, and I don't think people realize just how difficult Road America is. Because you're running so light on overall downforce, everything you do at the car has to be that much smoother, and your braking point is that much more crucial. And so it would have been so easy for him just to overcharge one corner slightly, Hunter-Reay to be on the push to pass, and he would have made the pass. So I give Josef a lot of credit because he didn't just dominate the weekend, but he when he was struggling, man, oh man, was he impressive, because he never put a foot wrong. I think overall, obviously, there was not a caution, and I know some people kind of felt like the race felt a bit processional, and certainly if you only looked at the top two, yeah, that was definitely the case. But outside of that, there was a lot of movement, and I think there was 160 overtakes. So it's not like there was lack of racing. It was just that it was all relatively clean, and I think we're kind of learning now the idiosyncrasies of this new aero kit, and that despite the reduction in downforce, it still is quite difficult to make clean passes, because everyone are basically running more or less the same pace. And I think when you have a race that basically forces everyone to be on the exact same pit window as far as your stops are concerned, then there's never going to be any huge disparities on people on empty fuel with old tires and full tanks and new tires and so on and forth. So I just think, because the overall length of the race, it was probably a bit more processional than it could have been had it been, call it, stretched out another 5 laps, or even reduced by 5 laps, because then I think it would have been, a more of a fuel save race, or even more of a full out race. So I think it was just kind of caught in the middle there, and because of that, I think it was maybe just a touch processional, because everyone basically had to pit on the same lap.
You raise a great point about Newgarden's performance, and the other thing for fans to keep in mind, Road America is a place which, as we know, has a number of not only high-speed corners, but relatively long corners. So the amount of time you are going through that corner with some sort of steering input added, it's significant. There are a number of places like that around the track, and with the elevation changes in mind, some changes in camber with the track falling away as you go further around the corner. Carousel comes to mind. If you have a handling imbalance, if in Newgarden's case you have a car that in the race on the Firestone Blacks, the primaries, is not super happy over the length of a stint, what you get is not little twitches, but holy cow moments. Or if you've got understeer, it isn't just mild understeer. That's something that you're carrying with you for a long time through a corner, where you're giving up time, or you're having these frightening moments where the back end's trying to come around consistently more than once through a corner. So I think to that point, Anders, you look at what he had to do and what he had to manage with a Ryan Hunter-Reay just on fire, with Scott Dixon charging from behind, with Alexander Rossi until he had his problems, with the camber shims applying pressure. Just thinking about the entire race from Newgarden's standpoint, but especially on the blacks, there are a lot of points where he was having to work miracles to not only keep the car on the paved bits instead of on the grass or the gravel or the tire barriers, but also to maintain a rate of speed that was going to keep him ahead of those who were chasing after him. So in that area, that's another thing that really stood out to me, where that kid had to work and do things with a car that wasn't necessarily on his side the entire time to get to where he was.
Yeah, for sure, and it was Road America is always so difficult to manage, and I've kind of been trying to think as much as I can about this new aero kit and why there is some slight struggle in following people with it, and I think it's because if you take a corner like turn 7, that's a super fast kink. With the previous aero kit, that corner was easily full throttle, even if you were following someone, because you had so much overall grip. But now it's close to being full throttle when you're by yourself, and that means it's a big lift when you're running behind someone. So now, percentage-wise, you're having to lift more. It's a bit like a super speedway, really. When we ran a bunch of downforce at Texas, and they could run 3 wide the entire day, and then when they reduced the downforce, you couldn't do that anymore because it's not that easy flat. So I think kind of now it's this year. What I like about this aero kit and the challenge that Josef Newgarden had is that you have to be so precise with your inputs. You can't just drive the downforce into the car.
Yep.
And it'll stick. You have to be so much more subtle with your inputs. So I think from a driver perspective, it's a way bigger challenge, whether you're out in front or behind. So I really like that, and I think it's just kind of these subtleties about the aero kits. I feel like the driver's still kind of figuring out how to manage that in traffic, and certainly we saw St. Pete and Long Beach, where you have all sorts of stop and go corners, it was pretty much carnage all the way through. But yeah, to your point about the time spent in long duration corners at a Road America, that definitely penalizes you a lot when you're light on downforce trying to follow someone.
Another fun thing, and I would recommend, I realize that I'm giving a recommendation for folks to keep tucked away for 51 weeks, but if you really want to get a feel for not only how the cars are handling, but how the drivers are managing a car that is either doing what they want or not doing what they want, the inside of the carousel, now that we don't have this crazy amount of downforce and folks can essentially just plant their foot for the most part, listening to the drivers' throttle inputs, how far drivers can maintain full throttle into the carousel, the point in the corner where they have to lift, how long they have to lift, whether they try and stab the throttle a few times. I've always called that maintenance throttle, to try and pick up a little bit of speed, but not to the point where you're causing the chassis to be unbalanced before they can get back to full throttle. Just if you are someone who enjoys the finer art of driving, that might be a place for you to go and check out either in practice or the race next year, because with this lower downforce too, I stood there, I was actually taking some photographs with Robin Miller in tow, but while shooting, or I guess while looking with my left eye through the viewfinder on the camera, I was listening with my right ear to see what was happening once the cars that I was tracking through the lens and what they were doing, trying to get through the corner. And again, just observationally, really interesting to hear that the sounds being produced and who was having to lift for how long, etc., was pretty much directly matched to where the cars were in overall speed, ranking from 1st to 23rd, as you would expect. Let's see, we had some fun in the race and some questions that have come up afterwards, but a certain 2016 Indy 500 winner, Anders. In my little note here, Alexander Rossi, dickish driver or hard-edged racer? And it's not as if Road America is the first time that we have seen Alexander give other drivers the business when trying to pass and get by. Had he and Takuma Sato became very close friends during the race into Turn 5, into Turn 6. Before I share my thoughts on this, what comes to mind, not just with what we saw this past weekend, but maybe cumulative effect recently of Alexander's rushing through the field and how he deals with those that he's trying to get past. Is he not friendly, or is this just the behavior of a hard-edge racer?
Well, he's certainly very show-friendly, I'll tell you that. But no, I think obviously the two instances you're referring to are the ones in Turn 6 with Robert Wickens and with Takuma Sato. And first things first, I just want to be noted that Turn 6 is a corner where it is nigh on impossible to run two cars.
Yes.
It is uphill, then you go over a blind crest, and it drops off. It's a bit off camber. And unless you're on the inside line, there's basically no way of hanging around the outside, and certainly it's not a very efficient way through there. And I think kind of having looked at the replay of Rossi's steering inputs, because that's pretty much the telling thing, is he never at one point opens his hands. He just kind of lets the car have its way and pushes it out. So I think, could he have given more room? Absolutely. But at the same time, he's just kind of following the arc of the corner. So I guess what it comes down to is the mentality of the race director and the people in race control, and that there's two sort of ways of thought on this. One is the person on the inside chooses and dictates the path, and obviously that's not the case on ovals, but on road courses, at least the kind of old adage is the person on the inside dictates the line that he wants to take, and anyone on the outside, well, if they want to hang around the outside, that's at their own risk. That's one way. The other way is you always have to give room to another driver regardless of where they are. So I think kind of the European mentality of that is, no, the guy on the inside always has the right. So if someone wants to try and hang around the outside, that's at their own risk. I think IndyCar in the last few years, there's been a little bit more of the mentality that you have to give room no matter where the other car is, and a lot of that has to do obviously with the oval mentality. So it really comes down to what race control wants to do. If they want to have a different mentality from road course to oval, if they want to have a different mentality, then I think what Alexander Rossi did is absolutely justifiable. But if they want to have the same mentality from oval to road course, then what he did is absolutely in the wrong. So I haven't talked to race control. I don't know what their mentality is, but at least in my perspective, that's what I would expect. And I know, even going back to my karting days when I was 10 years old, if I tried to hang around the outside of someone and got put off in the grass, my dad would, after the session, come to me and say, well, yeah, of course you were going to go in the grass. You were on the outside. And then obviously that completely changed once I got into open wheel cars and on ovals. Then it's basically, if you have position, you have the right to stay there. So, and that's by no means a cop-out. That's not me not having an opinion. It is literally just, these are the two sort of philosophies on how you can go about it. And I would actually fully support IndyCar regardless of whatever way they want to go.
I agree with many of your points. Maybe have a few other things to add in, conceptually at least. I actually do think Rossi is a bit of a dickish driver, but I don't mean that or say that in a negative way. I would say he falls in that hard edge racer mode. We're talking, if we wound the clock back 15 years, we'd be having the same conversation about Paul Tracy. And that guy is, for the most part, universally loved for that spirit. I'm going to attack. If I get a whiff of you, you better watch out, because a part of my car is going to hit a part of your car if you want to contest the position. Was it fair? No, not always. But was that an acknowledged and stated part of his driving personality? Yes. And so it's with that where I look at Rossi and say, he's definitely working from the Paul Tracy playbook more often than I've ever seen this year. To your point about coming up over the hill, if someone is on how's this? Let's actually go back to turn 5. If you are coming down the hill and you're on the inside and someone is on your outside, we saw this, I believe, in just about every single class this past weekend, whether it was World Challenge, Mazda Road to Indy, or IndyCar. If you're on the outside going around turn 5, you were often invited onto the rumble strips, if not the grass and dirt, and that seems to have become an accepted way of doing things. We get to the top of the hill and someone is on your outside. Again, in theory, and also in practice, we know that if the driver on the inside wanted to, you could get 2 cars through there. Wouldn't be easy, but it is possible. There's no automatic sense that if you're on the inside, you must take the guy to the outside onto the grass and cause them to not only surrender the position, but probably lose 1 or 2 more. Seems like, again, this is not limited to Rossi, but seems like you're on the outside in 5 and 6, well, then guess what? Off into the rumble strip or the grass you go. I don't know if that's necessary, but I know that at least if we come back to Rossi, if any driver was surprised that that's what happened, then they might not have been paying full attention to this Tracy-esque approach that he's been taking. The flip side to that, Anders, and this is a part that I'd love you to throw in your thoughts as well, you start to do this enough times in a series where on average you have 22, 23, 24 cars. You start building that that list where you got Sato going, okay, I remember that. You got Wickens going, okay, I remember that. You get too many people on that list. And do you have to start to worry about, we come to another road course somewhere, and good Lord, if Rossi finds himself anywhere near the outside going into a corner, he is going to have some comeuppance coming his way because that list he's built of doing it to others is too long?
Oh, for sure. I mean, you have to treat others the way you want others to treat you, right? So, I don't know if he would have attempted going around the outside of turn 6, and if he did, would he have expected to be pushed off or not, right? But yeah, you certainly have to expect to be treated the way you treat others, and that definitely goes on track. So I mean, he races people aggressively, and I'm sure he expects people to race him back aggressively as well. And then it's just a matter of if he gets a hip check, then he certainly has less room to chat than other people, in my opinion.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add in before we move on from this is we're not really in the new guy Alexander Rossi phase anymore, are we? Where, hey, boy, he's quick. This guy's looking like a future star. And would it be great if he finished somewhere the bottom half of the top 10 this season? This is championship contender Alexander Rossi. This is a guy who is tied for second leaving Road America. I'm not throwing anything cautionary in his direction saying change your driving style. I love it. But I was an unabashed PT fan, so I might, some listeners might be, highly, highly unpleased with some of Rossi's moves last weekend and this year, but I love it. I would say don't change a thing you're doing, but you do get into that thing where you go, man, if you are going to be susceptible to someone chucking you off the road at Mid-Ohio, Toronto, Portland, Sonoma, while you're vying for a championship because someone says, hey, I'm screwed. I'm 13th in the championship. I don't care. I got an opportunity for a little bit of payback. I don't know if you want to be the guy who's got that list of folks as you're vying for a championship who could control your fate. Forget what you did to them in one corner at one race. They could tank your entire season. So there is a little bit of a fine line of good citizenship to straddle here, possibly.
Well, and don't forget the fact that the guy leading the championship is never in any of those conversations. Scott Dixon, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say that he's hip-checked someone. I mean, the guy basically stays invisible until the last few laps of the race, and then it's like, oh my God, how is he on the podium? So, I mean, if you want to talk about polar opposites, and I think it's great for the sport that we have that, and you have Scott Dixon, who basically until the final few laps of each race stays, fairly anonymous for the most part, and then just kind of bursts onto the scene in a podium, or at least in the top five, and then the slightly more brutish driving style of Alexander Rossi. So, I mean, I think it's one of those where when all the stars align for an Alexander Rossi, it'll probably go, the highest of the highs will probably be even higher, but his lowest of lows might be a little higher as well because of that aggressive nature.
Well, you just mentioned the guy that I wanted to get into next, and that was Scott Dixon. And one of the funnier exchanges at the end of the race when Robin Miller made his way back to the media center just as I was finishing up my little race report. He had the look in his face, and I kind of had the same look on my face, and we both, came to the same conclusion immediately. Oh, crap. This might be over. And so this isn't just trying to fawn over Scott Dixon. This is just looking at past blueprints he has used to earn championships. And right now he's got, a 45-ish point lead over Ryan Hunter-Reay and Rossi, who are tied for second, 48 or so over Newgarden, even more over Power. Of course, and again, I'm not saying that things are done by any means, Anders, but you look at how the point structure pays out. You look at the kind of races we're going to, Iowa, a short oval, street course, natural Mid-Ohio, which should be renamed Scott Dixon International, a Gateway, a Portland, a Sonoma. Most of the tracks we're going to, he's won at, if not won multiple times, or is the kind of place where he's going to be there or thereabouts. Here we are now officially past the halfway mark of the season, Anders. We have 7 races to go. Scott Dixon has about a 1-race lead over the rest of the field from a points perspective. And if he can just float around the podium, maybe get another win somewhere here, but float around the podium, Hunter-Reay is going to have to win a lot of races to bridge that gap. Rossi, the same thing. Newgarden, Power, Rahal. There's a part of me that looks at this and says, there's going to have to be an epic collapse. That's all I can see. Dixon's going to have to fall apart, blow up, crash, you name it, for this to really start to become easier for the others to get past him. Do you think we're on that path?
If memory memory serves right, though, this Ryan Hunter-Reay fella has won more than once at Iowa Speedway. And, I think it can change so quickly. If you look at history, if Scott Dixon continues to control everything that's under his control, he'll be in a great position. But again, you never know. There can certainly be mechanical failures. There can be someone taking you out of a race on lap one and then lose you a bunch of points. We saw that with Will Power and Scott Dixon in Toronto, last year or the year before. So, I mean, these things can change extremely quickly. And I think what the competition needs to be afraid of the most with Scott Dixon is the fact that at ISM Raceway, he qualified 18th. And somehow, even though they were nowhere on pace, he managed to make his way up to 4th.
Yeah.
And that's what they need to be afraid of, is the fact that if you just leave Scott Dixon to do the job himself, he'll always get himself back up into the top 5 somehow, some way. And so the only thing that I really think can hold him back is if he has any major incidents or mechanical failures.
And the one question I asked him in the post-race press conference, and again, this wasn't trying to blow smoke, it's just I think you mentioned it and many others mentioned it during various radio and TV broadcasts. His number 9 Honda crew has been just murdering pit stops this season. I think it was last year, the year before, pretty much any time the number 14 AJ Foyt entry came into the pits, whatever position driver was in, this is whether it was Sato, whether it was Munoz, whenever that car came into the pits, you pretty much subtracted 2 to 3 positions. It was almost automatic. This year, the opposite has almost been the case wherever we go with Dixon and his Chip Ganassi team. So it's just funny how, again, there's some cars where you're like, oh man, this guy's having a good race. I wish he didn't have to pit because they're about to lose in 2 or 3 spots. Dixon, it seems like every time he comes in, if he isn't picking up a spot or 2, whatever the gap was to the car ahead, if it was 5 seconds, it's 3 when he emerges from the pits. They have just been doing incredible work this season. And I said, are you guys like giving them bionic arms and legs, or what the heck's going on there? And he said, honestly, it's just trying to be consistent. It's actually the opposite, not trying to do anything special, but just do the same thing every time and removing those variances so that over a race, the cumulative effect does gain him a lot of track position. So, yeah, the entire team there has gone from being good but not great entering Indy to really, really executing at a fairly crazy level. Well, let's pick up 1 or 2 more topics here, my friend, and then let's get to questions. We had this Murdy thing here at Road America, the old Mazda Road to Indy. Colton Herta picked up his 4th consecutive win, was genuinely bummed Sunday to see that streak broken. Wanted to get 5 in a row. I think he wanted to get all of them in a row. Victor Franzoni, you said some beautiful words during the Indy Lights broadcast on NBCSN about what it meant for Victor to get this win in light of his dear friend and benefactor Jeff Green, who died recently. In Pro Mazda, we had some great results. USF 2000, we had some great results. A little bit of strengthening of things in USF 2000, a little bit of, shuffling a little bit in Pro Mazda. Give me some thoughts of how those 3 championships, but also some of the players are, either newish players or those who've been really strong in their championship standings are making a statement here.
Well, I think if we start at the top and kind of work our way down to the bottom in the ladder, I think Indy Lights, it's been very impressive to see after Barber Motorsports Park, which I think was basically, in my opinion, Colton Herta's kind of low point of the season.
Absolutely.
When it looked like Pato O'Ward was just going to run away with things, to come back the way that he's done, and it can be so easy for him to just be mentally distraught after Barber and say, my rookie teammate has now crushed me 2 weekends back to back. Instead of that, he was able to completely mentally reset and have the best race pace he's ever had and manage tires better than he ever has. If you remember back to last year, that was his downfall. He had some 7 pole positions and only 2 race wins. This year, I think he's only got, 2 or 3 pole positions, but he's got 4 or 5 race wins. So it's been very, very impressive to see him kind of turn himself around and to the same point kind of now seeing Pato O'Ward grow, and I think this has a lot to do with his sports car program last year, is in the fact that now when he's slightly off pace, where back in his Pro Mazda days, when he was off the pace, he would get really flustered and start really struggling. Now he's just kind of putting the races together. So I think we clearly have two main contenders in Pato O'Ward and Colton Herta. Colton with a slight advantage, and the key now is coming into Iowa. Pato O'Ward badly needs to win that, and the only thing Colton needs to do is continue to stay consistent and stay on the podium. I think we saw a slight move of desperation from Santi Urrutia this last weekend, trying to go for that move up the inside, first outside, then inside of Pato O'Ward, and barged into the side of him. And I think that was basically Santi saying, if I don't win every race now, I'm basically going to be out of contention, so I'm willing to take those risks. And at that point in time, that the risk didn't pay off. So,
and you know what saddened me there, Anders, was, and we spoke about this a little bit on the broadcast, but I fear that Santi is painting himself into a position, reputation-wise, within the IndyCar paddock, that if he is going to have a future in IndyCar, it's going to be as a paying driver. Now, I'm not saying that he was at a point after his first, well, to be honest, he came close enough to winning as a rookie in Indy Lights and getting that $1 million, where I think something really positive could have happened. After year two, a little bit less of an opportunity. I just think that when you start throwing moves like he did, which we were both very critical of, I think folks stop looking at you as a genuine talent to nurture, and knowing that we have a Colton Herta, a Pato O'Ward, and some other really unquestionable talent, cleaner talent, if you almost want to put it that way from a driving standpoint. I just fear that, I don't know if Santi has any more moves like that left before people say, I'll talk to you and I'll possibly put you in an IndyCar, but it's strictly because you're bringing money, because I haven't seen you continue that same caliber or quality of consistent driving that you demonstrated in your first season. Am I being too harsh there, or do you think there's anything to that?
And I mean, I think if you kind of go into the mental as well there, here's the guy who just narrowly missed out on the championship to Ed Jones in his rookie season, and Ed Jones since went on to finish third in his rookie Indy 500, and now in Chip Ganassi. So I think you can look at that and argue, in that year when Ed Jones won the championship, without a doubt, Santi was the quickest. Then you go into last year where Kyle Kaiser wins the championship, but again, second part of the season, after all the mechanical woes and a couple of crashes were out of the way, again, he was by far and away the quickest driver of the season. So I think you can very easily get into a situation where you think, well, I deserve to be an IndyCar and I should be an IndyCar, and because of that, you're not 100% in the game as it pertains to Indy Lights. And I've seen that before, and actually worked with one driver that it kind of reminds me of a little bit, and that is Pipo Durrani, who came to do Pro Mazda when I was a sporting director at one of the Pro Mazda teams, and he wanted to do Indy Lights that year, but only had the money to do Pro Mazda. And because of that, his mindset was always, I should be in Indy Lights, I should be in Indy Lights. And because of that, he never fully accepted in his head that he was in Pro Mazda to do a job and not just collect the scholarship check, and therefore didn't work out for him. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's just a little bit of that desperation, a little bit of, I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but a little bit of that, well, I should be in IndyCar right now. And because of that, you can't dedicate 100% of your energy to be in Indy Lights. And whereas I think for Colton Herta and Pato O'Ward, they feel like this is where I belong, this is where I need to be, and this is where I need to prove myself. And I wouldn't be surprised if subconsciously there's a little bit in Santi where it's just like, I've already proven myself, and now I just need to go win the championship. So that's my analysis. By no means am I a psychologist, but that's kind of outside looking in the way it could appear.
Let's move to USF 2000 and Pro Mazda last weekend. I don't know, man. I love all the series on the Mazda Road to Indy, but I love the fact that, if we look at who we thought might win, you don't always know what you're going to get. And that, admittedly, that's kind of what this entire ladder is meant to do. I mean, we've had years where a driver dominates. They take everything. They take all the cookies. No one else can have any. And, we still have some of that going on this year across the 3 steps. But we also have a little bit of, is this going to be the one? Aha, he got a couple wins. That seemed to me as well, the bottom 2 rungs, there was a little bit of that as well.
Well, and the strange thing about it is you have 2 pretty defined leaders in their championship. You have Kyle Kirkwood in USF 2000, and you have Parker Thompson in Pro Mazda. But the crazy thing is the reason why both of them are at the top of the charts isn't because they've won substantially or because they've dominated pace-wise more than anyone else. It's just that they've put everything together, and they've just been a bit more consistent. And I think Parker Thompson this weekend was a great example of that. He didn't quite have the pace to win the races, but he still finished ahead of his championship rivals in both races. So I think he finished 4th in both races. It was a great breakout performance for David Malukas in Pro Mazda, because he had yet to win a race on the road to Indy last year in USF 2000. Was super quick, but just very inconsistent, but he finally put it together, and I wouldn't be surprised to see someone like him go on a run now and start just winning races back to back.
I thought he looked like a kid who unlocked something last weekend, and yes. that was the fun thing where I was going, okay, well, thanks, Parker. You've been making things a little bit boring. Aha! Could this get a little spicy?
No, exactly, and I think in USF 2000, Kyle Kirkwood is just showing his experience compared to the people that he's racing with. He did F4 last year, won that. He's done F1600. He's done a bunch of karting, and I think he's slightly more experienced and slightly more mature, I think, than the majority of the competition. And I think that's really what won him both the races this last weekend. And now he's got a huge lead in the championship. I mean, he's basically got one hand on the championship trophy and the prize to move up to Pro Mazda for next year, thanks to Mazda and Cooper Tire, of course. So I think I've really seen a mature approach from him. When he's a little bit off pace, he just works at it, just takes one position at a time. But when he does have the pace, he's just out in front and pulling away.
I think we need to start the Kirkwood to McLaren rumor. Should we do that here? Should we do that now?
How about we do that? Perfect.
All right.
He can be the American Lando Norris.
See, look at that. Well, actually, my pal Trevor Green-Smith, affectionately known as T-Max, assistant engineer on the number 19 Dale Coyne Racing entry, is a spitting image of Lando. So we might have to slide him into the car there. Well, let's close, before we get to Q&A, Anders, on silly season. I happened to write a little story heading into Road America that uncorked a couple of fun things that were in development. I'm sure you heard plenty from folks over the weekend about rumors and rumblings. I know that I heard a few more things which might, some were probably more accurate than others. There was one colleague of ours who was convinced that McLaren offered Scott Dixon $8 million a year as a salary, and I can't vouch for whether that is or is not accurate. I can tell you that if that was the amount being offered, which is more than an annual budget for just about any IndyCar entry in the series, that sure would be hard to turn down. Again, that's supposing that's accurate. Who knows? Another point that I heard that might be closer to accurate than not, but we will obviously find out, is that Toronto, either during the Toronto event or possibly shortly thereafter, in or around the Toronto event, might be the time where this, what we believe is the McLaren Andretti partnership for a 2-car entry would be unveiled. That is, if everything gets signed off. Have heard that is very close to happening. So if that were to happen, if everything does get the green light and it were to be unveiled in and around Toronto, that makes me question whether the Latifi family angle that I wrote about, Mr. Latifi having invested $272 million in McLaren, whether that might be something. If not, it would be really strange to just do this in Toronto for no reason, knowing that the Latifis are from the greater Toronto area. So a couple of nuggets there. Also confirmed with Brian Barnhart, president of Harding Racing. I know you and I discussed this, Anders, that they are looking at running a second car later in the season, 1 or 2 races maybe, and had heard they might be looking at a young Indy Lights driver. He did acknowledge they're looking at something along those lines, but also looking at possibly some other drivers who might bring some funding. So, fun weekend for silly season. What came across your old radar there, Mr. Krohn?
Well, I still keep coming back to this McLaren thing, and if they did indeed offer Scott Dixon that, I think if it was any other driver, I would say they would run and take that deal, with both arms wide open. But I think if you're Scott Dixon, and I've tried to kind of put myself in his mind, and he's making good money the way it is. I have no idea what his salary is, but he's certainly not going to be hurting for cash anytime soon. So I think for him, he's got, how many years do we think he's got left in his IndyCar career? Another 5-6 maybe?
Yeah.
Something along those lines. I mean, I think in the position that he's in right now, with Chip Ganassi Racing having downscaled and all in focus, I think even if you are offered that amount of money, I think it'd be tough to give up what you currently have going on, because it's such a good program now. It's so well built around him and molded around him that I think going away from that, regardless of money, would be a huge risk to kind of mess with. So I don't personally, if I was Scott Dixon, I don't know that I would seriously consider it, unless you decided, hey, at the tail end of my career, I want a new challenge, and I want to prove that I can do the job with a different team. Then of course that could be the case. But I feel like if he ever wanted that challenge, he probably would have done it by now, considering he's been with Ganassi for 20 years or something like that. So I think that's pretty interesting. Obviously, very encouraging to hear that the McLaren thing is moving forward. Be incredible to see them on the grid with a 2-car effort, and certainly hope that they'd bring back the papaya orange again to the IndyCar series. I think that looked absolutely brilliant. So. What else did I hear? No, I mean, you obviously filled me in quite a bit more on the Harding side of things. I think it's so awesome that they're looking to the Indy Lights series for their next talent, instead of just going, to Europe or elsewhere, or looking for, an established driver. I love the fact that they want to take the punt on a young up and coming driver that can, really challenge them from a lot of perspectives. And I think Matthias Lace this year has shown his worth. I think Zachary Clayman de Mello has shown speed. He's been a bit inconsistent, but he's certainly shown a lot of speed. And I think Kyle Kaiser, even though he's had some troubled runs, he's actually shown some good speed as well. So I think it's kind of showing that the Mazda Road to Indy is actually pretty solid at the moment. So it's great to see that the team owners kind of looking down the ladder, as opposed to just looking for someone that would be an easy choice, someone established.
And I'll add one other thing that came to mind on the Dixon front, and we might get into this a little bit in some of the Q&A that's coming right up. As you mentioned, Anders, that number 9 Honda program has been built and refined around him for, he's in his 18th season now. I'm not saying that all the crew members have been with him for 18 years, but many have been with him for a super long time. And if I have a concern, forgetting the money, forgetting everything else, it would be a concern over upsetting the health and balance of the series. If Scott were to leave, I don't know the employment contracts that the rest of the crew on the number 9 happen to have with CGR, but I think of someone like his crew chief, Blair Julian, how he and so many of the people who work on the car and the engineering side, Spotter, so many have been with Dixon for so long. I'm making an assumption here, Anders, but if he were to leave, I'm knowing that Andretti, who we believe would get the contract, would need to go and hire the people to run these cars. They don't have, to my knowledge, enough people internally to shift over full time. My concern would be is how many of Dixon's, quote, people would want to move across with him, and would that completely deplete and or destroy that number 9 entry for whomever would follow him. And that's another big thing too. I'm just trying to look at Domino's here. So they have a new sponsor that has come along. Obviously they signed on knowing the quality they would get, the expectation of wins and such. And it's one thing when the driver goes, but if the driver and the chief mechanic and, pick many of the other vital components that help Scott to win, if they're gone as well, you don't just go and find those, equals sitting on the curb waiting to be hired, those people are precious, precious stones. And if they were to leave, I think there'd be very serious concerns about how they might be able to attract the next Scott Dixon if they weren't able to step into that championship-winning crew that Dixon, would potentially leave behind. So the possible destabilization of the CGR program as a whole, that's the thing I'm thinking about. So while I love the idea of Dixon driving for McLaren, the Kiwi-founded team, his hero, etc., bigger part of me thinks, this might actually hurt IndyCar more if one of its marquee teams is heavily shaken up by not just driver, but possibly some of his top-tier talent going with him. So that's my little fear for the week. All right, let's move on to Q&A. We've got you for about 20 more minutes, my friend. As we do at the beginning of every Q&A session, we mention that our friends from TorontoMotorsports.com kindly award the person who asked my favorite question from the previous week either a T-shirt, a Marshall Pruett Podcast T-shirt, or a mug. I'm told that there are 2 mediums, 10 or 12 larges, and 10 or 12 extra large shirts left from the first batch that was run. So, we are indeed going to give one away, but we're going to try and do something a little bit different here after this week. Now, let's get to who is going to get the shirt from last week. Corey Matthews, you opened up a question here which was actually initiated on Twitter with Eddie Gossage after Texas, and I just enjoyed going back and forth with Eddie. Corey asked, what do you guys think about Texas being right after Indy, as Mr. Gossage discussed? So I enjoyed that in particular, so Corey, send me a little DM here on Facebook with your address and either shirt size preference or mug preference, and we'll get that mailed off to you. And then going forward, Anders, knowing that, again, there's about a little over 20 shirts left from this first batch, my friends at TorontoMotorsports.com said, hey, we're going to sell those now. We're going to basically just do a really friendly promotion through the podcast. $15 for the shirts, and $15 in Canada is $15 there. Here, it's about $12 and change, $13. So shipping to the U.S. is about $5. So again, round numbers, you're looking at roughly $20 if you want a large or extra large, and I think there are 1 or 2 mediums left. So just trying to get those blown out because we're finishing up a new Week in IndyCar cartoon, like the Week in Sports Car cartoon that we have. We're going to use that for a new batch of shirts to run. So trying to get the old ones, or the first generation ones, I should say, sent on to new homes. So check out TorontoMotorsports.com, and there you go, a little bit of swag. All right, Anders Krohn, we got lots of great questions here. There's no way we're going to get to all of them with the 20 minutes or so that you have before you have to get on a flight, but I'm going to do some overtime and answer as many as I can. We're going to start here with a certain network that you and I love. This comes from @16th_Georgetown on Twitter. Let's cut to the chase. ABC, ESPN did IndyCar no favors for a long time. Please prognosticate the, hopefully positive, effect that NBC will have over the next few years on our beloved sport. Now, as someone who may or may not receive a paycheck from that company, Anders, should I be the one to weigh in here, or are you comfortable talking about the Peacock?
I will say this. I've now worked with and for NBC Sports for the last 5 years, actually. They gave me my break in broadcasting in 2014 for the Indy Lights thing.
Now you know who to blame, listeners. Blame, yeah.
Exactly. No, and I think what I've seen from top to bottom at NBC is just passion. And it's not just passion for making money and passion for putting sports on TV. It's passion for IndyCar. And the lengths they go to generate stories and good shows week in, week out is just incredible. And I mean, it starts from top to bottom. It starts with the Rich O'Connors, the Sam Floods. It starts with Terry Lingner, who puts out the plans for every single weekend, and they really set the standard because they work their tails off to every single weekend know exactly what the main talking points should be, and from there, all the talent that's working on these weekends. I mean, most people may not see it, but when they're not on air, they're out in the paddock looking for different stories. They're looking to talk to the drivers, to the teams. What's the strategy going to be like? What are the storylines? What are the struggles? What everything that's going on. So I think the single biggest thing that NBC brings to it is commitment to the sport of the Verizon IndyCar series, and you see that in everything that they're going to do. The fact that every session next year is going to be broadcast on NBC Gold, it's going to be on air certainly. So in my opinion, everything that I've seen, top to bottom, they're such passionate people and they love the sport. And because they do that and add that to their expertise in broadcasting, it's going to be brilliant. So not saying what an impact it's going to have on ratings, that I have no idea about. All I know is when they took over the Kentucky Derby a few years ago, the ratings for that has since exploded. And I'm sure that they will do the exact same with Indy 500 and all the other properties as well.
I'll add one other item here, and now that I'm remembering it, I did one interview at Phoenix with one team's commercial director, and I actually need to complete the interview with a similar director from another team so I can get the story out 4 months later. I am fairly confident that the most positive effect we're going to see is on the ratings side. It's an assumption, but I think it's a fairly safe assumption. And what I think we're going to see here, what I believe and what I've heard from some that I've spoken to informally in the paddock, is what's the number one thing we talk about wanting more than anything for the series, Anders? Bigger TV ratings, not for the sake of just having more people watching the sport, but for what those ratings mean to sponsors, because bigger ratings will unlock bigger dollars, more money coming into the paddock, healthier paddock, more cars, more everything. This is where we start to grow the value of IndyCar. The more people that watch, the bigger the number teams can use to put in front of potential sponsors to sign on and get involved. And that, to me, in terms of potential, knowing that we should have stronger average numbers for the average events, but hopefully bigger numbers for the big events like Long Beach, like the Indy 500, and a few others. If we are able to arm the commercial directors, the sponsorship hunters from all the teams, even the series when they're looking for title sponsors or event sponsors, if you have bigger, better numbers to offer and you can legitimately command more money because you can say you have more people watching, that's the thing that has honestly been holding IndyCar back for a really, really, really long time. Not saying that NBC/NBCSN, which will be broadcasting the series exclusively starting in 2019, is going to do quadruple the numbers. I mean, we have to be reasonable with our expectations, but I do believe we're going to see a positive uptick, and every increase in those rating numbers is only going to help the paddock seek bigger and or better sponsors and maybe even more money from the ones that they already have. Let's see. Let's move on to Chad Smith. He says, Anders, if you had the two-seater with a goal of making your passenger wet themselves James Hinchcliffe style, which would you choose? Turn 1 at Indianapolis or the kink at Road America?
That's actually a fairly simple one. I think that's got to be the kink at Road America, because you visually have a bit more time to prepare for turn one at Indianapolis, whereas the kink at Road America just comes at you and just punches you in the face. And I think it's a little bit more bumpy. It's a slight uphill, and then obviously with the forest kind of hanging over it, I think it's probably a bit more visually impactful, certainly for someone if it's the first time in a car.
Liquid on the course in the kink. Liquid on the course at the kink. Let's see. Mike Stoops has 2 questions specifically for you. Anders, if you ran Indy Lights, what would you do to help grow the field?
Oh man, how much time do you have?
Well, we're actually short on time, so make it a quick one.
No, I think one of the biggest concerns over the last couple of years that actually has had some effects on this year, I think, is the fact that there was some engine unreliability and some performance differences between engines, and I think that drove some people away from the series. I think, from my understanding, is this year the engines are a lot more close to each other, so I think that's helped a lot. And then really, if I ran Indy Lights, the only thing I would do is on a very granular level see how can we help lower the budgets, because there's a lot more people that can spend $750,000 a year than there is people that can spend $1.2 million. And also, I think we can't underestimate the fact that now Europe has done a really good job at adjusting themselves to the kind of financial status we're in, and sports car racing in particular in Europe has gotten very, very cost effective in the European Le Mans Series. So I think now, where before it was only GP2 and World Series by Renault competing against Indy Lights, now you have to look at European and American sports car series for that matter as well, where you can spend similar money. And some would argue that your future prospects, if you don't win the Indy Lights Championship, they could argue that the future prospects are better by going to a sports car series. So I think really the key to growing the Indy Lights field is how do we justify and how do we find a way to lower the budgets overall for the teams to still be able to run fiscally responsible, but help lower the budgets. And I think that's not an easy answer. There's a lot of different factors that come into it, but that would be my primary thing is how do we lower budgets 10-20% and really just set that as a standard and see across the line, how do we lower the cost of tires? How do we reduce the amount of tires used? How do we lower the cost of the engine lease? How do we lower the cost of the parts and so on and forth? So anyway, I'll leave that at that so we don't run too much overtime here.
No, and I would say it's more like a third. We genuinely need to look at how do we knock a third of the price off of the annual budget. And I mentioned probably a month or two ago my last bouts in Indy Lights as a crew member in 1996. Our annual budget for one car was about, of the two entries we ran at General Racing, one car, its budget was $1.1 million, and that was someone whose family was very wealthy, and we were able to command top dollar then for that. And the other one was on about $900,000, and the fewer bells and whistles, not much in the way of hospitality anywhere. But this is going back more than 20 years, Anders, when Indy Lights was a true factor. This is when Tony Kanaan, Helio Castroneves, a bunch of just fiends were in the series. Greg Moore had just graduated before that. So this is an era where massive stars, big profile, big sponsors were even involved. And back then it was being done on 1.1, 1.2 as a peak. Here, 20 plus years later, smaller everything. It's it's crazy to think maybe it was a bargain back then, but now you would think that with the scales of economy it would be less than it is. So getting it down to the 800,000 mark or so, I think that's the huge difference maker. Let's see, a couple more questions here for you, my friend. Josette Torres, how much fun was it to call the Freedom 100 this year? I needed a warm blanket and a nap after all that excitement.
Well, and that's the perfect segue from the previous one, because it turns out you don't need huge fields to put on incredible races. And I think Anderson Promotions and Mazda did a really smart decision there by just turning down the engines a little bit for the race to be able to make the racing a bit closer, because we know last year it was a bit strung out, but this year the race was absolutely brilliant. I mean, it was we couldn't take our eyes off it, and we had no idea at any point who was going to win the race. So it was a brilliant race, and I think it was great for Colton Herta to break through and win that race. And it was also great that until really the start-finish line, we had no idea who was going to win it. So I feel like we've been spoiled the last few years with some incredible Freedom 100s.
All right, one or two more for you. This comes from Joey of the Priuses. Anders, why do you think that Norway has far less representation in circuit racing than fellow countries of Sweden, Finland, and Denmark?
Well, if I'm an example, then we must just be lacking in talent. No,
hey, no.
No, I think you really have to go quite a ways back. I think it starts with the fact that Norway in the 50s and 60s never did have a Formula One driver. So the culture for open wheel racing and circuit racing just was never built. It was always built around rallycross and rally. And if you look at it now, the representation Norway has in rallycross on a world stage is absolutely massive. I mean, we have 3-4 drivers that are competing for world titles. We have a Norwegian World Rally team with Volkswagen and Petter Solberg, and in rallying as well. It's crazy. So what I always found is that the understanding in Norway for what I was doing at the time, and certainly when I went to America, that there was just such little understanding because there hadn't been a culture built for it back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I think that has a lot to do with it, really, because Norway does really get behind its athletes, and still when I went to America, there was some people, hyper interested people that followed, but it is difficult for people to kind of grasp something that's so foreign to them.
Well, we're still trying to get you into something, and maybe we'll squeeze in a little question from this guy Marshall of the Pruetts. So you've shifted career-wise into broadcast. You have a communications company that you own and whatnot. So if IndyCar, which was your goal, and obviously you were a talented driver in Indy Lights, Mr. Krohn, or up through Indy Lights level, would you be open to some GT stuff, sports car stuff, not necessarily pulling you away from your primary duties on open wheel weekends, but if you could do some sporty car stuff in World Challenge or IMSA, would you be open to that? Or are you one of those folks who's happy to have done it but now say that chapter's closed?
Well, I think if you're a racer, then you never truly close that chapter or close that book. So I'm going to go so far as to say I am not actively pursuing anything, nor have I for a few years, and I'm quite happy with that. However, wouldn't be surprised if a couple of years down the road, if I just do some club racing for fun, and certainly wouldn't say no to any opportunities that pop up. But I'm not. I'm sort of so focused on what I'm currently doing that I am not going to take any time out of my day to go pursue rides, because that also means pursuing money, and these days I'm trying to find money for other people and not myself. So yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't turn it down, but with that said, I'm also not going out of my way to seek those opportunities.
Well, wait until I've got a couple little Anders running around the house and you're starting to think about paying for college. I think you're going to be trying to find what, you're going to pay me $7 to drive this weekend? I'll be there. All right, let's close with a fun question here that draws directly back to what you're doing now. This comes in from Corey Matthews, who will be receiving a little bit of swag for your question last week. It says, Anders, do you feel that you prepare differently for a weekend when you're on NBCSN/IndyCar Radio than, say, a broadcasting major or someone who studied media and journalism, being that you have experience behind the steering wheel? So interesting, because obviously outside of your longer-standing NBCSN work, you've been a phenomenal, much-needed addition to the crew, alongside with Mark Janes, Nick Yeoman, Jake Query and such, Dave First on the IndyCar Radio Network. But how do you prepare differently for what you do in this new career, talking into microphones, compared to race weekend as a race car driver?
In many ways, it's actually quite similar, just in the way that you have to do your homework, you have to be prepared, you have to know what to expect out of the weekend. So if I was preparing for a race myself, I would know exactly what engineering challenges we'd have ahead of ourselves and what we'd be looking to get out of the car, and certainly strategy. And the same exact thing goes for what I'm doing now, except now I have to explain that to everyone listening. So it's just a little bit of a different approach in that now when I get this information, instead of trying to use it for my own benefit to go quicker on track, I now have to use that for the purpose of explaining why that is. And that's what I, to be honest with you, that's why I've had so much fun the last 5 years doing the broadcasting, is because I feel like my passion is racing. I love it every single weekend, and I love being able to share that passion with other people. And not going to claim to be the most knowledgeable person in the world, but certainly I love sharing my perspectives and the little bit of knowledge that I have, and the little bit of knowledge that I'm able to gather from the teams and drivers week in, week out, and try and convey that into kind of some tangible stuff that most people can understand. So Preparation-wise, actually shockingly similar, except I don't spend as much time in the gym now as I used to. But outside of that, very, very similar.
And thankfully, just this year, we've been able to get you to take off the balaclava for the weekend and actually, just kind of walk around looking normal. So that's a good thing. Well, all kidding aside, as I mentioned in the open here, Anders, I'm so happy to have seen you reach a place within our industry on the media side where folks know that when they hear you speak, they're hearing something compelling and honest and probably going to learn something. So really cool to see you be able to achieve that. And as you know, one of the highlights of any weekend for me is if I happen to be at an Indy Lights race and there is a seat open. I know that you and I and Kevin Lee have a lot of fun in the booth there, just being ourselves, talking about stuff that we love. So just happy for you, brother. Happy to see where you're at. And, I'm a big fan of what you do. I know you got to get on a plane here, so thank you for your time on the Marshall Pruett Podcast, Week in IndyCar. We are going to dive into some overtime questions with just me, but we need to let Anders get busy and go find some money for a driver.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me on, MP. It's always good fun having a tin wag with you, and look forward to the next time.
Amen, brother. All right, let's continue on with the fun. I'm going to see how many I can get through here in a half hour or less. Mike J., you said, please explain more about the camber shims that Rossi's car had issue with and the difference in camber shims for road course, street circuit, and ovals. Mike, no difference. The shim style of using incredibly either thin or thick plates that drop right in. They are machined to specific thicknesses that teams will use and know that if they either add in one of a certain thickness or take away one of a certain thickness, that will either increase or decrease the camber on each corner of the car. What we had at Road America, honestly, is not too uncommon, where if you're running over the rumble strips on corner exits somewhat consistently, we see this happen in open wheel, we see this happen in sports cars, wherever the kind of sandwich style of camber shim suspension is used, where you bolt these shims between the upper A-arm and the upright. You see that this does happen more often than you might expect, of getting loose and camber shims either falling out. That doesn't happen so much. There have been some smart kind of retaining systems put into place, but what you will get is a front wheel or rear wheel that's no longer completely secure to the suspension and will either flop around a little bit or just be generally problematic. And the good thing to know here is the Andretti Autosport team and other teams, I'm sure, all use a specific torque spec, a number that they know that once the camber shims are in place going into the race, that they would torque the nut on the stud there to a specific number. And again, I know that I believe it happened to two of their cars on Andretti Autosport, but regardless, it's not uncommon here running over these rumble strips. We again have seen that happen a number of times. So let's see. Anthony Ghosh says, with Harding Racing exploring adding a second car and looking for a promising young driver, who among the talented Indy Lights field is most ready to compete in the Verizon IndyCar Series right now? I'd say the one that's clear and obvious is Colton Herta. Obviously, Pato O'Ward, that is a kid that I would say that on his day might be a little bit faster than Colton, if we're just talking, one lap speed or a number of laps strung together. I think his peak might be a tiny bit higher, but what we've seen with Colton, which maybe feeds right back to the question of ready right now for IndyCar, Anthony, that kid is versatile. If he needs to be in full attack mode, you're going to see him attack for the entire race. If you need him to be smart and conserve, if the car is not perfect, and if he were to push too hard, it would burn off the front tires or rear tires. We've seen him in Indy Lights now for a year and a half, more this year than last, but we've seen him in particular recognize whatever deficiency is in place and then drive to the car's ultimate capability without hampering himself too heavily. Those are the kinds of things that he is going to face in IndyCar every weekend. So I would say that of everybody in lights right now, Colton would be the one who I think would show up and really impress folks. I don't think he's going to show up and blow people away, because you rarely, if ever, see that in a rookie driver of his age. We discount someone like Robert Wickens, who is closer to 30 than 20, realizing that he has a lot of experience he's bringing in as a rookie. Colton at 18 years old definitely has a lot more to gain. But yeah, Colton, period, end of statement. Let's see. Let's look through a few more here on the good old Twitter. Then we're going to move over to Facebook. Nate N. Wilson, at N. Wilson 24/7. Good to know that you are yourself every day of the year, Nate. Is there any real steam to Michael Andretti buying an F1 team? If so, who do we see as his two drivers? And could this allow for more IndyCar/F1 crossover from series to series? I'll be honest, Nate, I really try to look into most things that I think folks would ask about. This isn't one of them. It hasn't seemed like something that was really headed towards a realistic acquisition of Force India, which is what I've read he might be looking into. If he is capable of doing that and is able to do that financially, then obviously that'd be a pretty darn cool thing. I'm not sure that's going to happen, and that's why I probably haven't spent any time really trying to get to the heart of it. So if I am wrong, then I guess I will be following others who have taken a lead on the topic. So at least for now, Nate, I really don't have much to add. And as for who we might go after for the two drivers and crossover and such, one thing I know in IndyCar particularly that might be a bit different culturally than Formula One is we tend to like consistency here. Sponsors, if they're going to invest, if we're looking at Andretti, for example, whether it's DHL or Butterball or you name it, they want to know that Ryan Hunter-Reay is going to be their guy, and it's going to be their guy for many years, so they can build marketing plans, marketing programs, advertising around him and that car. I would say the same thing, that same mindset would not change here, which would then possibly make it a bit more difficult to just unplug an IndyCar driver, send him over to F1, take an F1 driver, plug him in over here. So if we're talking multi-year program where they're going to come in and stay or leave and stay over there for multiple years, could be a possibility. But other than that, I don't know if we would see much in the way of crossover like that. Adam Klinger, thanks for coming out to the live podcast and bringing your family as I take a sip of coffee here. Adam said, will Phoenix be the only subtraction? I always come up with a new word every episode. That's it, subtraction. Will Phoenix be the only subtraction from the calendar? How safe is Pocono looking for 2019? Also, if I win the Powerball, I'll bring back Cleveland. Thank you, Adam. I would love to have Cleveland back. I would say Pocono is probably the only other event that I'm looking at with a real question mark about next year. I know the track has said that, the audience size comes up a little bit each year, a little more ticket sales, a little more ticket sales. It's also one of those tracks that we've mentioned in recent episodes, Adam, where, boy, unless you are 75% full, it just looks empty on the good old television. And even, those who are in attendance watching it, the sponsors who might be coming out, you never want sponsors to say, where is everybody? Did I invest in the right thing? And while I think many of us love Pocono, its traditional spot on the calendar, what it means to IndyCar from a historic standpoint, the racing has also been good there. I just don't know how many tracks IndyCar can keep on the schedule where if it is half full or less, it's actually truly helping the series compared to hindering it, while it continues to say it's growing and getting stronger, but has some events that as soon as you flick on the TV, you go, ooh, well, not there. I don't think we're going to see much in the way of subtraction, as I have added into the lexicon here, Adam. There are some other questions, and I'll kind of roll them into this one as well, with folks asking about what's going to replace Phoenix. As my colleague Robin Miller at Racer Magazine and Racer.com wrote, Homestead is the absolute favorite to replace Phoenix. I've heard that it's more than just a favorite. I've heard that it is could be effectively a done deal. I know that kind of falls in, Adam, to that same line of thinking of, last couple times we went to Homestead, we didn't have a whole lot of people in the grandstands. I think we had as many, if not more, star drivers, bigger names in the series back then. Where, again, if you're just looking at, well, if someone heard the name or was interested, would those names back then be more likely to get folks to come out than now? Possibly. Are the cars prettier? Maybe is there a general buzz and better feeling about the series now than then? Yeah, probably as well. So that's why I'm not sure. I know that there was a lot of skepticism at Road America last weekend, Adam, for those who did hear that Homestead might be the place to replace Phoenix. I've been there many times. I don't dislike the track. I don't dislike anything about it. But yeah, if we're trading a mostly empty Phoenix for a mostly empty Homestead, I'd almost rather just not go. But that's just me. All right, last question for Twitter. This comes in from Joel Swaim. With a change in ownership, do you think we will see a return to WeatherTech Raceway, Laguna Seca, for IndyCar? Well, Joel, quick little point of interest here. Change in title sponsorship, but ownership of Laguna Seca is still in the hands of the county itself, Monterey County, so no change there. I'm actually hoping to get a closer answer on this here shortly. Meant to speak with the new track president this morning, so when I do, that is actually my number one question after all the other upgrades they'll be doing at the facility. Be interesting. I don't think the Bay Area here where I live can sustain 2 IndyCar races. Sonoma, as much as we love it, is not a place that has even come close to packing the house, I think, ever for IndyCar. Its return, I mean, keep in mind it was there in the late 60s, early 70s, but if we look at least modern times when it returned in 2005, I think the 05 crowd was strong, and 06 as well, but since then, just not a huge turnout. So if you have one place that's, I think, questionably half full, then moving 2.5-3 hours south to Laguna Seca, a place that really struggles to put proper behinds in seats at its events, I guess modern racing events. They do great for the Rolex Monterey reunion, the what used to be called the Historics. When bikes show up, we have great turnouts. But for any of the modern stuff like IMSA, like World Challenge, just don't get a lot of people. And even the last IndyCar races there, it was a ghost town. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think if there's going to be a race in the Bay Area, it needs to be that A race. Part of me wonders if there's a question of, should we just try and see if we can get a crowd back to Laguna Seca. But like I mentioned, I believe last week's episode about Texas, and whether Texas should be given the coveted direct post-Indy calendar slot. Maybe, like I suggested with Texas, some market research to find out if locals who maybe once did attend IndyCar races and put lots of people through the turnstiles there at Laguna Seca, would you return and do that again if we held an IndyCar race? I don't know if that marketing research has been done, but if it has, or if it can be done, that might be the answer. If there are chances of a bigger crowd there, I'd say go for it. Would love to see it crowd size. To me, that's really just becoming the all-important delineator between whether we should be at a track or not be at a track. So if there are better odds of that happening, more people coming to Laguna than Sonoma, as much as I love Sonoma, the thing I'm most interested in is IndyCar's long-term health. So go wherever the most people will go. Just can't say whether that would be the top of the bay or well below the bottom of the bay here. All right, we are going to switch over to the good old book faces, to Facebook here, and close out this episode. And I'm going to get through as many as I can. Joshua Krohn, I recently heard the McLaren was prepared to offer Scott Dixon a, quote, offer he couldn't refuse, love it, Mafia style, in order to secure him next year. Any ideas on what an offer of this type would include? Personally, I think Scott Dixon Motorsports sounds pretty good if and when he retires. As we mentioned earlier with Anders, the rumor, and I can't tell you whether it is the least bit accurate or not, was $8 million a year. And if that is the case, that would be hard to turn down, especially in the scenario that I think I wrote about and Anders mentioned as well. You know, Dixie has, granted, he can probably go as long as he wants, but he's 37, going to be 38 here soon. I don't know, maybe another 5 years if he wants to do it for another 5 years in IndyCar. What do you do? Do you say, hey, I've had an amazing career with Ganassi, and now not only would I be paid a crazy cool amount, but I could do it driving for McLaren. You know, if you're looking at what is realistically, Joshua, I think maybe a factor that has to be brought in even more, this could be Scott's last biggest contract or series of contracts. Because I don't know whether it'd be 1 year deals with McLaren or a 3 or 5 if that were to take place. But think of this as almost the retirement tour. He's obviously, if he wants to, going to continue in sports car racing and can do that for 10 more years after IndyCar if he wants. But sports car racing pays nothing like what he would get as a top-line IndyCar driver. So if we're just talking income, that drivers tend to have very finite careers and rarely get into second careers afterwards, as whether it's a team owner or a business owner that is also lucrative. I might be looking at this if I were in Dixie's place going, all right, I got a couple years to really put up some big financial numbers to secure myself, my family, my kids, their kids maybe. Should that be the route to go? Or does loyalty? I mean, after 18 years with the same team, I'd say the loyalty thing's been proven. So, anyways, interesting. Just maybe keep in mind that Scott's looking at what could be his last big earning potential before that gets significantly smaller in outside of IndyCar if he wants to go that direction. Nicole Bitzer, I noticed how big the crowds were at Road America this past weekend. Was that one of the reasons why IndyCar is going back up there? I would say that's the key reason, Nicole. Boy, big crowds, passionate and enthusiastic crowds. Also heard, and I should have looked into this beforehand, but heard that the track, after increasing some prices last year, which did not go over that well, and I think led to a slight downturn in attendance after the big turnout the first year in 2016. I heard that some prices were brought back down for 2018, and I believe that's one of the factors why more folks, I think, than ever turned out during this first 3-year contract. Now we know that we're going to have a second 3-year contract. Let's see. Adam Smith, do you think we could see IndyCar return to Charlotte? Or maybe a trip to the Atlanta area? Having been to Charlotte back in the IRL days and seen some good racing there, also some sad events there with fan deaths and such, I do not think, Adam, I don't think we're going to see IndyCar back in that market anytime soon. Atlanta area, have had a couple folks say, hey, what about Road Atlanta? I mean, it's a fantasy. I would just love to see IndyCar there. Little bit concerned about the speeds, though. There are some places, even with an LMP2 style prototype in IMSA, which it's not frightening, but if something goes wrong, you would be massively concerned. And with an IndyCar, the fact that we do have some crazy high speed areas with grass and some tire barriers, but concrete behind those tire barriers. The fact that we do not have an IndyCar with nearly as much, just say, stuff up front to prevent major damage and an impact, that might be the thing that keeps IndyCar away. Not saying that Road Atlanta is dangerous, just saying that IndyCars that can crack 200 miles an hour in the straight there, those are slightly different beasts than prototypes going significantly slower. Let's see. Brian Smith, how much of this Wickens-Rossi feud is real, and how much of them is playing it up because of having a villain makes the show more interesting for the fans? And this goes with another question someone asked on Twitter. It wasn't in the episode thread about my thoughts about Rossi possibly doing a heel turn, to use WWE terminology. I don't think it's manufactured, Brian. They are friends, but they're also now competitors at the highest level they've ever been. So I think they are finding out on the fly, race by race, that the strands of friendship are getting stretched perilously thin when it comes to being on the same track, in the same general piece of real estate, and going for either position or the win. St. Pete's the obvious example. I don't think anything that Rossi is doing is intentional to be the heel. I think that personality-wise, the big surprise, if he were to go, again in WWE parlance, the babyface route, and just be the sweet darling filled with love and mirth, I think Rossi has a natural DGAF, that stands for don't give a bleep, approach to others when it comes to his racing. Not that he intentionally is trying to knock people off the track, but what you want in a elite race car driver is a hunter-killer, someone that is going forward, has no real concerns or consideration for you and your race, and in order to get to the front, will do anything he or she is allowed to within the rules, or that the race director will hopefully not frown upon to get there. And knowing that is an impersonal thing. Rossi, I think, again, just looking at driving personality and also knowing him a little bit, he can be a fun-loving guy. More of his personality is coming out, a little bit more lighthearted, but I've also, for the first time this year, referred to him as Robo Rossi, and that is because when he is behind the wheel, the guy's a machine, just pure cold metal, definitely not too concerned about any others, and he's not the first driver to be like that. There are many who have been like that, been very successful. I just know that when he comes upon or is interacting with his quote friend Robert Wickens, I think we're finding out, or Wickens is maybe finding out, that okay, now I see the delineation between when we might be friends and have friendly conversations outside the car, but when we are in the car, you're willing to push things to levels that I have to adjust to if I want to compete with you head to head for years to come. So, if anything, I would say, Brian, I don't really see Rossi as a villain. A couple more moves like that, though, and I think it'd be pretty easy to paint him into that. So, if he cares, that might be something for him to be mindful of. But if anything, I would say in this specific dynamic you mentioned between he and Wickens, Robert might need to out Rossi, and a hip check here or there, or invite him onto the dirt or grass somewhere, just as a reminder that, hey, okay, I can play this game too. What I'd hate to see is Wickens end up as the perennial recipient of the highly aggressive moves from Rossi and not fight back. So we'll see what happens there. But to me, this is more of a Wickens question than a Rossi thing, to see how he adjusts going forward. Let's see. Kevin Pinkston, this is an awesome question. On the heels of such a great crowd at Road America, has there been any rumors or discussion of IndyCar coming to VIR, Virginia International Raceway, one of my favorite circuits in the world? Yeah, and as you mentioned here, it is a great facility. The track owner, she is just the best in the world. And IMSA, as you also mentioned, brings out a great crowd. So does World Challenge. If there's a place where I think IndyCar could go and succeed instantly, I would say VIR might be it. It's also another crazy high-speed track. Little bit less perilous, at least the way my mind works, compared to a Road Atlanta. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is something that IndyCar is looking at. I'll need to ask Mark Miles next time we speak, but I think there'd be a huge crowd. I mean, truly huge crowd. If it was packaged maybe with World Challenge, I think the place would just be bursting with people struggling to handle all the demand. And I think the racing as well would be crazy because it is a high-performance track. Handling really does matter, but it also has some long straights. So push to pass, get thrown in there from a strategy standpoint. And yeah, I think I think if IndyCar were to consider VIR, if VIR were to consider IndyCar, I think it'd be A, a smash hit, but B, I don't think it would ever come off the calendar afterwards. So that would be pretty awesome. All right, Darren Dubois, your next question. When calling a race, which track has the most difficulty from a vantage point of view? I would have to say Le Mans for sure. 24 Hours of Le Mans. The last time I was there in 2016, I believe, might have been 2015. I apologize. Did a couple of stints, I believe, with Radio Le Mans overnight, and the situation there is right at the Ford chicanes, which is great. The only problem is you have a 8.5 mile road course, a radio/broadcast setup that is fixated in one, call it tiny section, and just about everything you are going to see take place is going to happen through television screens, because while we have wonderful view looking out of the booth, looking onto the Ford chicanes, other than a pass into or coming out of, you get to see the cars for, I don't know what the exact time is, maybe 5 to 6 seconds a lap, maybe 10 seconds at most, but on a lap that lasts multiple minutes, when you only get to see the cars for 5 to 10 seconds, that is certainly a place where you have to rely on what the TV screens are telling you, and probably even more heavily on what the timing and scoring data is telling you, having to pick out what's happening. So that's the one where you just get a tiny sliver of the big track, and especially at night, you have to get creative. Let's see. Where else should we go here? Michael Wallace. Hey guys, just a fun question here. What do you think about a 24-hour IndyCar race, complete with driver changes and everything? Thank you. I love it. I'm all for it. As you guys probably know, I cover sports car racing just as much as I cover IndyCar racing, and would love a 24-hour IndyCar race. Now that could be fun. The only question is, do we do like a 1-car, 3-driver lineup, which is kind of the norm for a 24-hour race? Therefore, would it be Penske with, say, 2 cars, one with their 3 IndyCar full-timers and the other one with Montoya, Castro Neves, and maybe Dane Cameron or Ricky Taylor? I'm liking the idea here, Michael. I don't think it'll ever happen, but I would be the happiest guy if it were to happen. Daniel Kincaid says, on the Mazda Road to Indy car count topic, is it possible to go from 3 to 2 classes with a uniform chassis, then have air updates for the higher classes, basically like now with the Tatis chassis, the common Tatis chassis between USF 2000 and Pro Mazda, both more power and a little more aero. That way car owners invest in one chassis and can move up with their driver. Makes the jump to IndyCar bigger. Is that a realistic thing at all? And a way to increase the grid and Indy lights? As we discussed earlier, Daniel, it is a financial numbers issue right now with the Indy Lights car count. It's also a team owner issue. Not that the owners themselves are the issue, but we've had a number of teams either move up to IndyCar, or we have had their Indy Lights presence, the footprint there, reduce significantly as they start to focus more on IndyCar. In that dinner I mentioned at the beginning of the episode with Mario, he mentioned if his son Michael didn't show up for one race, more than half the grid would be gone. And that's, again, a huge concern when one team is putting more than half of the cars on the grid. Andretti Autosport's responsible for 4 of the approximately 7 that are turning up for every round. Thank you to the Brian Bellardis and the rest, the Ricardo Juncoses and such, that put the other cars on the grid. But yeah, right now, not only does Mazda Road to Indy need more cars just on track to grow the overall presence of Indy Lights, it needs team owners. And we already have this dynamic that you're mentioning with a common Tatis chassis that can be used in USF 2000 and Pro Mazda. I don't know if any real changes are needed, Daniel, when we're talking about consolidating classes or common chassis beyond what we already have. Just need to look at getting the budget number down in Indy Lights, and then I think more team owners, hopefully those in USF 2000 and Pro Mazda, can start to sell an Indy Lights program and jump up there as well on their end. Let's see. Ignacio Aguirre says, questions here. What was the reaction from the public at the track for this race? It didn't look like an action-packed race, but I know there was a hundredths of a second battle between Josef Newgarden and Ryan Hunter-Reay plus Dixon at one point. Were the people happy, etc., etc.? Again, general reaction, I think we had a lot of fairly happy people with what was going on. A caution, as Anders mentioned earlier, I think would have spiced things up a little bit, but hardcore racing is something folks are accustomed to. If they're going to Road America, keep in mind that we have IMSA showing up each year, and while you tend to get your fair share of cautions there, it's intricate racing. Multiple classes, multiple themes. I would say the Road America fan is one of the most educated you're going to find anywhere. And the fact that sports car racing has been a constant, even when open wheel stepped away for a little while. I think the average fan knows to listen to an IndyCar radio or an IMSA radio or something else during the race to really get deeper insights as to what is happening, so that even if it is something where we don't have a ton of movement going on at the front of the event, you can listen into the other plots and themes that are going on. So yeah, it would have been great if Josef and Hunter-Reay and Dixie were just swapping places constantly back and forth, but this to me was just a really excellent flat-out battle, and having a couple of those each year is certainly, for me at least, not a bad thing. Michael Wallace, another question from you. What do you think is compelling for teams to spend millions in Formula One and not in IndyCar? What benefit is there between the sports? There was a ton of development at one point in IndyCar. A little bit of a, maybe at least how I'm receiving, a little bit of a weird question, Michael. Formula One is and has been the world's most popular, most viewed, most everything form of motor racing for longer than I have been alive. Its value on an international stage far surpasses anything a regional domestic series like IndyCar could offer. So, simply put, if you want to connect your auto racing, your automotive company, your commercial brand to the world, Formula One's it. So I don't know if it's compelling teams to spend millions in Formula One. It's been an institution forever. In terms of benefit, obviously IndyCar, we have domestic fans captured, but the audience size by comparison is a rounding error versus what Formula One will draw if you include all of the various locations and regions where it is watched, either on television or consumed in person. So it's just, it's night and day difference. Let's see. Justin Walsh, kink or carousel? The kink is obviously a place where a test of bravery is involved in many racing series. Again, referring back to a conversation we had a little bit earlier on this episode, with a reduction in downforce in road and street course trim, carousel became more interesting for me than ever, because since it wasn't flat, you could listen to what kind of car the drivers had to work with, good or bad, and how aggressive they were or were not able to be. So normally I'd just say the kink period, but if we're sticking with IndyCar, I would say, again, the carousel, go check it out. It's a very telling thing as to how drivers are doing, how their tires are handling or hanging on, and then also just to hear their various driving styles of how they use the throttle in and out of the corner. Let's see. Jerry Suda, thank you, first of all, Jerry, for I believe you send in questions for every episode, which is pretty amazing. I've read some discussion of the potential introduction of low-profile tires and bigger wheels in F1. Is there any potential that IndyCar could do something similar, and how much of an effect would it have on the cars? I haven't heard anything about it. Keep in mind the lower profile the tires. You are hardening, for the most part, the sidewalls. There's less springing. The taller the sidewalls, the more it can be used and tuned by the tire supplier to have, again, a handling performance and effect. I don't know of any real need that I can think of to change that on the IndyCar front, considering that we have a very diverse series. Formula One, they obviously do nothing but road and street courses, primarily natural terrain road courses with a select number of street courses. IndyCar, as we know, very different creature, where Firestone outfits cars for short ovals. I guess everything other than a short oval is kind of referred to as a super speedway, but for me at least, I think of Texas as a little bit of its own character, since it's a 1.5 mile banked. And if we look at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and Pocono, those are big old giant ovals, true super speedways. So yeah, we've got Gateway in there as well, which is also a bit unique. So you factor in all those, the number of street races, the road courses. I think with what they have, with the current size and the current everything, Jerry, I think they've more or less struck upon something that really works wherever we go. So I don't think we're going to see any changes there. F1, though, since it is a little bit more specialized, that might be an area that they could do that. Let's see. David Zitterbart, friend from Australia, here. Hey, gents, with the DTM and Super GT finally coming together and creating a Class 1 rule for a combined series to use in 2020, referring to a common set of GT-style rules where they will be building to a same spec that can be used back and forth. He said, is this something IndyCar should look into with Japan or another country with a prominent open-wheel category? This is probably where my protectionist mindset comes in, David. First Indy 500 was held in 1911. This series of ours, it's, the oldest thing. It is a part of our brick and mortar in terms of racing series. Should IndyCar adjust its rules so it can align itself with another championship somewhere else? I would say the exact opposite. If another series, open wheel series, wanted to align itself with IndyCar to create a pipeline to the world's number 2 open wheel series, I would not be against that at all. But IndyCar actually trying to align itself with something that could be used, with Japan's Super Formula or whatever else, and that's no disrespect to any other series, but IndyCar's kind of a big deal here. And while I would welcome the opportunity to have another series wanting to align with what we do so they could come over and play however often, I would really struggle to see IndyCar saying, how can we change what we do to maybe get someone else to come play here? Just at least for me, my sensibilities, which could be different from your own, David, or others, the scenario presented here feels a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. All right. John Sable. I've had a couple of people ask questions about this. Marshall, saw your article about Harding possibly expanding to 2 teams later this year, 2 entries. My question is the latest thing I heard about Harding was that sponsorship search has been rough. The team sounded more in the red than in the black. Is this the case? And if so, how are they able to add a second car? Is this a situation of one car, of one pay car supports both cars? I think you're onto a lot of things here, John. I can't say as to whether they're in the red or the black. I'm sure they're in the red, but I do know that having spoken with the team, I think we might have mentioned this last week as well. They have wanted to sign sponsors from the outset. I think they've been a bit surprised that they haven't had sponsors come in and essentially take more of the financial burden, if not all of the financial burden, off of Mike Harding and the Harding Group. I do know that they have shifted their approach. Instead of going after, call it straight money sponsorship deals, give us money, we'll put your name on the car, that they are looking into far more heavily into business-to-business deals where they can offset costs through various business trades and alignments. But yeah, I do believe you are spot on with the goal of adding a second car, probably with one other angle too. It is meant to be a paying opportunity, someone bringing money for that car to be run. Naturally, you would factor in some sort of profit. Probably wouldn't be huge, but the ability to generate income from the second car, I think that's something that they would like to explore and prove to themselves that can be done at this early stage as a rookie entrant. I'd say the second part too, John, is also trying to showcase and entice folks looking to 2019. So at least for me, any profit, I don't know, 50 grand, 100 grand, I don't know what the number might be. I mean, both, if they could make 25 grand or 50 grand off of running the second car per race, that would be a pretty big thing, albeit a small drop in the bucket. But I would say most of all, this would be a demonstration exercise that we can bring on someone, run them hopefully competitively for a couple of races to close the year, and then really become a more ambitious and significant player during the off-season to fill that seat. Heck, even last year, before they had become a full-season entrant, they were saying how they wanted to move to two cars, but there was still that question of proving the quality of what they had to offer. We can see that this year they have had struggles in showing that they can be a front-running team. Not a surprise. I mean, Carlin Racing as well, an international superstar of a team when it comes to junior open wheel racing. They have shown that with ample budget, they are by no means looking that much better than Harding Racing. So no discredit to either. Just shows how tough it is for a rookie team to wedge itself into the more established programs. We've saw as well, wrote about how they have promoted their technical director, Gerald Tyler, into the, I don't know if promoted, because technical director is actually above race engineer, but Gerald's taken over the race engineering for the car as of last weekend. Gabby told Robin Miller and myself that we're really going back to zero. It's kind of starting from scratch, and it looked like it. They were bog slow all weekend. Did speak with Gabby this morning, though, and he said in the race, we really did need a yellow for our strategy to pay off, but he said we were in the running to finish somewhere around 12th, and the car was much better, much faster. So it sounds like they've made progress already with this engineering change, John. And I would say that, there are many others who have said or commented, what do you mean you want to go to two cars? You haven't even shown you can do the first one properly. Again, I can't argue with that view just looking externally, but the whole ambition here to get this second car out later in the year is to show the rest of the paddock, plus those on the Mazda Road to Indy or in Europe, that when you're thinking about 2019, we've shown you we're a two-car team, and we aren't just talking about our desire, but you've actually seen it on track, and hopefully it goes well enough to where they can entice folks to buy in and spend money with them. Let's see. Peter Peel, what is the popping sound Indy lights cars make under deceleration/braking? Almost sounds like the opposite of a rev limiter. That's the electronics going, trying to keep the turbo spooled up, Peter. So, electronics at play, throwing some fuel into the exhaust chamber to pop, burn, explode, keep that turbo spinning when the driver is off throttle, so that when they do go back to throttle, they have, instead of big old turbo lag, the turbo is already spinning and provides power sooner. Let's see. Jim Johnstone, do you think that a better TV package and the possibility of McLaren and maybe Fernando Alonso joining IndyCar next year, this could entice more engine manufacturers to join? perhaps a Renault with their past success with Alonso, or Toyota with their recent success? Well, Renault, unless I am forgetting something, does not sell cars in the United States, so I could not think of why they would join in, John, unless that is something they're doing and I've missed it, or they have plans of doing that here ASAP. Toyota, I mean, that's one of the dreams, that they would come back, knowing the size of the company and how hard they play wherever they go race. That would be a fantasy scenario. I mean, if anything, I would hope McLaren would become an engine supplier, but as Zach Brown has told me many times since he took over McLaren Racing, in terms of businesses and budgets and marketing and everything else, the McLaren automobile side is wholly independent from McLaren Racing. So if McLaren is on the grid next year, or in however many years in the future, that would be McLaren Racing, and a budget dedicated for McLaren Racing. If McLaren on the automotive side wanted to get involved, spend money, develop engines, and put those in the back of a McLaren Racing entry, that would have to be a conversation and a funding that happened externally from the racing team itself. I would say, and this is just guessing and supposing, that provided there is a McLaren Racing team on the ground starting in 2019, that the variety of McLaren dealers in and around the United States would certainly be drawn in somehow to come and support, come check out, corporate hospitality and enticements, because this would be their biggest involvement in North America from a racing standpoint. We have McLarens competing on the GT3 and GT4 level, primarily in the Pirelli World Challenge Series and also IMSA's Continental Tire Series, but those are more Pro-Am type things. But yeah, would be interesting, I think for sure, if McLaren decided to get involved. And if they were, I would guess it would be in and around the new engine formula due here in 2021, I believe. Okay, we are winding down to the last couple of questions for this week's episode, gang. Brian Carr. Hi, Marshall. My sisters and I bought my dad a ride in the two-seater with Mario at Road America for Father's Day. I noticed the engine note of the two-seater was much deeper sounding than the normal Indy cars. What, if any, is the difference between the two? Funny you should mention that, Brian, and great question. We have engines in the two-seaters, and I believe they are different. In one, maybe the deeper, richer sound, I'm assuming you were in, was the one which uses actually the previous generation Honda, the naturally aspirated V8 that was used through 2011. The other, which might have been the one you're in, I believe is a turbocharged Buick, but my brain might be farting a little bit on that one. But yeah, you do not have a current twin-turbo Chevy or Honda V6 in either. So, not sure which one you're in, but yeah, since these aren't meant to be exact replicas of the current Delar DW12s with their exact engines, the two-seater experience folks kind of make use of what they can to make them go quickly and last a long time and be easily serviceable. Andy Burns, and thanks for the photos from the first ever Marshall Pruett podcast live. Track limits. It pains me when I hear these two words. Me too, Andy. In sports, clear definition of the boundaries of play are nice. Massive runoffs from a fan's point of view really lessen the wow factor and individuality of a track. Just try to create another new word. What are your thoughts on this general trend of road courses continuing to pave any area where a car might go off track? It's funny, the use of quote track limits has been almost exclusively a sports car thing in North America. We obviously hear it in Formula One as well. Yeah, I am, I think, of the same mindset as you, Andy. If you can drive on it and gain traction and go forward, then I think you should be able to use it, and I don't want to hear track limits and the concerns of that being passed down by the race director. I know in World Challenge over the weekend we had qualifying laps thrown out because of certain drivers exceeding what that series said was the boundaries of the track. But I do like, Andy, which you mentioned here as well, is I think there has to be a penalty for wanting to play on that margin and exceed, meaning here is the width of a reasonably paved circuit. There might be some rumble strips on the outer edges in the corners, but elsewhere it is going to be grass or dirt or something. And if you go off, then you are going to spin and crash or lose time out on that non-traction providing surface. But when you do, just pave everything. I realize that there's the safety aspect to that, and you say, okay, well, this is great. If you go off, then there's lots of grip and you can slow down and be safe. But yeah, I would like, how's this? I'm thinking of Circuit of the Americas, for example, and I apologize and I'm forgetting the corner number, but you have the final corner leading onto the front straight. The corner preceding that is one where I've seen I don't know how many cars just go 3, 4, 5 car widths out into that runoff area and then come back to the track. And that, to me, since the corner itself is not so dangerous entering it, meaning they're going a million miles an hour, and if there were to be a brake failure or something else, you need a lot of runoff, almost like, thinking like a drag strip to slow them down. Yeah, that whole thing's paved, but maybe you need to insert some sort of barrier, big, deep tire barriers, a reasonable distance off of the racing circuit so that there's no option to just drive out wherever you want, even though it is paved. So I'm with you on this one, Andy. I don't like the paving of everything unless there is a corner where you go, ooh, we really need this pavement for safety reason. Other than that, and leaving that open, I think, really getting into this track limits thing, it makes me think of balance of performance as another needless thing intervening in fun that probably only confuses the average fan going, wait a minute, that person just got penalized for driving on the racetrack? Huh? Let's see. Jim Johnstone, another one from you here. Bit of an out there question. What about IndyCar trying to become the headlining race at Trois Rivières? I love Trois Rivières. I know it's a tight course, but it hosted Indy Lights, Atlantics, Q&amp, ALMS and such. It has an existing track setup, built-in fan base. Seems like an excellent option. I've, at least for what I seem to recall in recent years, it looks like the crowd's been down a little bit, Jim. If I'm wrong, someone please correct me. Yeah, it's brutally tight, and I think it would put on a horrible show. Smaller cars getting through there, you can have more fun, but IndyCar with length and width, that would be a snooze fest and a wreck fest. Granted, I do love the idea of going to French Canada, practice France, as I lovingly call it. So getting to Quebec somewhere, doing something in the general French-Canadian somewhere, all for that. I just don't see Trois Rivières as being the right fit in any capacity. Don Gregory, in your opinion, which engine manufacturer would make a good candidate for the third or perhaps the fourth engine manufacturer to enter the series? They said Ford would seem like a natural fit with their twin-turbo V6 already competing in the WEC and IMSA. However, could Alfa Romeo or Toyota be in the position to possibly make a comeback to the series? Yeah, I gotta admit, Don, as for good fit, I can come up with reasons, and I think you and every other fan can come up with what we consider to be good reasons, or who might be a good candidate to become that third or fourth manufacturer. The fact that it hasn't happened yet, I know that we had Lotus the first year of the new formula in 2012, but if you count off 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, now 18, that's a lot of years where no manufacturer has found the value to jump in. And I think it's going to be a couple more years until we get to this new formula before it happens. As for, who would be a good candidate, I think it's an intriguing concept, because what has IndyCar said their new formula is going to be? More or less the same thing, slightly bigger displacement going up from 2.2 liters to 2.4, and more horsepower. The current engines are just little jewels. They are beautiful, incredibly high tech. They make a lot of power without a lot of displacement. They also make very, very good mileage from a lifespan standpoint. They last for quite some time. There are many things that are meritorious about the current engine. The only detriment that I see, and I've been fairly consistent in this, Don, is it's not forward-leaning, right? It's twin turbo, okay, that's kind of common. I realize that's becoming more of an industry standard. It's small displacement, okay, that's great. We've had small displacement engines for not just in IndyCar, but just in the world for decades. So while a good thing, that's fitting with current trends. It's direct injected, which is great, but again, current and has been an ongoing trend. We don't know what fuel they're going to use, but if it sticks with ethanol, okay, that's fine. It's, a good E85, but, that's no longer really a cutting-edge thing by any means. That's the only part that concerns me. That's the thing I've told Jay Fry and others at the series about, that, look, I love the big horsepower, and et cetera, but if you're going into the next decade and saying no hybridization, no, I don't know what it might be, to be honest, but we're kind of sticking in an old school-ish, just all motor mindset. And even the American Le Mans series back in 2008, I believe, here, if I'm just looking at an American series, brought in, or I shouldn't say the series, but entrance, opened the door, and entrance brought in hybrid power. 2009, we saw some of that. We've seen on the sports car side here a variety of things that you would say were cutting edge, a decade ago. And we know that IMSA, the modern version of the American Le Mans series, has said by 2022 they expect hybridization to be standard in all of their prototypes. Not saying hybridization is the only thing, Don. I'm just saying that whether it is alternate fuels, could it be a hydrogen, I don't know. But my only concern, if I'm looking at which manufacturer might be a good candidate, I don't know how many would say, yeah, this all-motor, non-hybridization, let us play, let us bring some whatever will be the next decade's cutting-edge concepts into the game. I think that might be the thing that takes some out of the conversation, because they realize that IndyCar is just going to be more of a ongoing traditional engine format. So I know that doesn't answer your question in terms of which brand, but since we haven't had any come in, and since the series has said we're going to kind of stick with what we're doing, just bigger horsepower, I wonder if that's going to be at odds with more manufacturers as we step into a place where modernization is really becoming absolute part and parcel with what the auto industry is doing. Let's see. I'm going to try and grab a couple here and then say farewell. Kyle Brown. As final pit stops were approaching in Sunday's race, one of the broadcasters made a comment to the effect of, the longer driver X goes on his second to last stint, the less fuel he needs to take during his final stop. He said, I've heard the same logic shared multiple times in other broadcasts, so it seems to be common knowledge in the racing industry. My problem is I don't understand it. Well, in a very general sense, and I realize that Sunday's race was 55 laps. I'll just say 50 laps for the sake of explanation. If teams are doing 3 stops and a driver during their second stint can push longer, and I don't just mean decide to stay out longer for the sake of it, but actually be competitive while staying out. They've taken good care of their tires and probably also saved a little bit of fuel so that they're not having to run slower to get to run longer on that second stop. In theory, the later that driver can push the second stint, the more laps they can complete making the final stint one where they will have obviously fewer laps to compete to get to the checkered flag. Those are fewer laps that require fuel to go into the car to get there. So for those that could push and do that, that means that you are spending less time on pit lane. For those that might not have been as fortunate, who had to pit a little bit earlier than maybe was optimal at the close of their second stint, it's very likely they would have had to have sat stationary for longer. And so again, that's the general mindset there. Hopefully that explains some of it, and if not, send me another note and I'll try again next week. Let's see. Andy Burns, again, are any of the late 90s kart cars still in operational condition with the same engine? Or do the manufacturers take the engines back at season's end? How feasible is it for a demo run at any of the tracks? How awesome would it be to hear 16,000 RPMs and high boost cars again? Yeah, Andy, in many cases, if we're talking manufacturer engines, a Honda, a Toyota, a Mercedes, Ilmor, most of those are not in the original cars that they powered. Cosworth has really been about the only patron willing to make their engines from that era available. And yeah, I mean, I know our friend Dario Franchitti, for example, has one of his old kart cars that was Honda powered, but I believe, unless something has changed, even he, the favorite son of Honda, cannot get one of those engines to power it. I do know of a project in Australia where a gentleman reached out, having gotten a hold of one or two of the old kart, 90s kart All-American Racer Eagles, and I believe has early generation Toyota motors to go with those, so that would have been period correct. Granted, those motors are kind of donkeys, but that's an exception for sure. But yeah, I believe Cosworth is really about the only place willing to make motors from that era available, and I've heard they're not cheap, but not a surprise there. Let's see. Paul Davis, let's close with this. Hi, Marshall. I'd like to hear your thoughts on teams/broadcasters knowing how much push-to-pass the other drivers have and when the drivers are using it. At Mid-Ohio, Tim Cindric was coaching Josef on when Ryan Hunter-Reay was using his push-to-pass. I believe that push-to-pass info should be kept by the teams and not shared. I don't disagree with you, Paul. I really don't. How's this? If I think of push-to-pass as a driver tool, something that they can use to improve the performance of their car, that to me would fall into the same category as anti-roll bar usage and position, or in the ovals, the use of a weight jacker. And something that, again, is directly influenced by the driver can, in theory, all the other tools would be used only to improve performance. It is, I realize that push-to-pass, it's an artificial thing, right? It doesn't have to be there. It's thrown in to spice up the show. There's part of me, that says, I hear what you're saying, because we don't have information on, so-and-so has adjusted their front anti-roll bar from, slot 2 to slot 5, and that must mean that they are having this handling imbalance that they're trying to cure. Hey, my driver who's following them, so-and-so is dealing with understeer, just made an anti-roll bar change to try and cure that. Try and push them a little harder if you can to see if we can exploit that problem. I mean, that kind of info isn't made available. So then why would push-to-pass, which is also cockpit controlled? Yeah, I think the one thing that maybe makes it a little bit different, Paul, is the fact that it's purely for entertainment. It's meant to spice things up, so we do have more passing. As for the amount, I don't know if the amount that's left necessarily needs to be made available. That's presented on the timing and scoring information that all the teams can see, and I believe fans can as well, through IndyCar.com. As for when it's active, that's a good question. I'll have to ask Jay Fry if they think that might be something to keep out of either public view or team view, because in theory, I guess, if it wasn't made available to the teams, but the broadcasters would see it, that just means that every team would be having someone listening to the broadcast and cluing them in as to when it was being used. But it's an interesting one. I mean, I hate push-to-pass. I always have. Like I hated the Hanford device. I mean, it's just a gimmick. But part of me thinks that as someone who does try and tell the tale of the story for what I do in the media, or sometimes, last weekend in the Indy Lights race, the Sunday Indy Lights race with Anders and Kevin Lee, I mean, we were doing exactly that, watching push-to-pass, how many pushes that the various leaders in the Lights race had, and how that was becoming a strategy. It helped us to tell the tale. I also think, maybe to close on this, Paul, and to close the episode here, I think that there's value in allowing at least the fans to know what's happening when it's being used. We don't have DRS like they do in Formula One and the DTM, where you simply cross a timing stripe. If you're within, X time or distance to the car in front of you, it's automatically activated, and therefore, in some instances, zoom, the trailing car goes by into the braking zone. This is kind of a pick and choose when you want to use it thing, and I think if we're going to see a driver on the button consistently to make a pass, I think if possible, if you see that, it's worth pointing out, because if you have someone who's just really going forward in the race, and they've done it by pressing a button to make that possible, compared to not relying on the button so heavily and just making daring passes and maneuvers, I think it's worth pointing that out. If we want to, I'm not saying it takes a driver is less talented if they use push to pass, but I do think if we're looking at someone move forward in a perspective of accuracy or telling an honest tale, if we're going to celebrate driver X for pulling off a bunch of great passes and moving up the field, and we see that they've essentially hammered that push-to-pass button to death, and it's just hanging by an inch of its life because it's been pressed so many times, I think it's important to say that, because if that's the mechanism that got them to move forward, cool, but that wasn't necessarily something that would push us into hero worship. If we use Alexander Rossi for one final example here, we think about many of the passes that we've seen him pull off on the ovals this year. I mean, that's just going to the high side, taking big risks, and oh my goodness, how did he not crash? And he just got 5 cars or whatever it is. That's the stuff that absolutely deserves our hero worship. That is big balls, big talent. I am going for glory, and at least with my sensibilities, Paul, that's what we should be talking about. And here I am. I'm talking about it. I'm hoping many of you will be talking about it for years to come. The things you've seen Rossi do that have just been phenomenal and outside the norm of what most of the other drivers were doing, again, whether it was Phoenix or there's Indy, etc. If he was just doing that because he kept his thumb on the button the whole time, yeah, there's still skill required to make those passes. There's still daring required to make those passes, but we would know that there was a little bit of artificial help involved. So, again, there's a part of me that totally agrees and gets what you're saying. I just know that as someone who is responsible for trying to tell the story and provide a little bit of couching of what happened, contextualize things. If we have someone using a button to go forward versus someone using daring and pure daring and talent and whatever chassis tuning ability that they have, those are two different stories to tell, and I think one is more valuable than the other. All right, we are at the end of this week's episode of The Week in IndyCar on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires. Thank you all for listening in. If you can, visit our friends at torontomotorsports.com. They will have the final of the first batch of the Marshall Pruett podcast t-shirts available for roughly $20 out the door, shipping included, to the United States, roughly around that number in Canada as well. And as soon as those are sold out, We are hoping to have a brand new second batch done with our new Week in IndyCar cartoon as the main character on the front. And then also I'm going to get to work here and follow up on some of the new inquiries that have come in about doing Marshall Pruett podcast live episodes, not only at some of the aforementioned sports car events, but also 3 or 4, possibly 3 or 4 IndyCar events to close out the year. And if those are things that continue to be of value and, I don't want to say popular, but like, hey, we like being at them and there's something that we want to see happen, maybe that can become more of a regular thing that I can help put on with the tracks or with manufacturers or sponsors or whomever it is, asking for them when we get into 2019. All right, I'm going to drink something here. My voice is kind of on the rev limiter. And that is all for the June 26th episode of the Week in IndyCar. Talk to you all next week.